On January 23rd, Microsoft, Koei Tecmo, and Team Ninja shadow dropped Ninja Gaiden 2 Black, a visual remake of Ninja Gaiden 2 that combined elements of both the vanilla release of the game, which launched in 2008 on the Xbox 360, and the Sigma version, which released on the PlayStation 3 a year later. The differences between the versions is a whole separate can of worms that I'm not going to get into in this video, because it's not the subject here. The subject is the simple fact that, even in spite of its clear changes and removal of some content, Ninja Gaiden 2 Black is still a very slick, fun, and gratifying game to play at a basic, foundational level. I played the vanilla game back for the Xbox 360 way back in the day and loved it then, but this visually upgraded re-release on Unreal Engine 5 just proves that its controls and overall gameplay loop hasn't aged a day. Just the simple act of controlling Ryu Hayabusa and slicing down enemies that turn into gore fountains is amazing. The moves you can pull off and the way he's animated just makes you feel like a badass, even if you're not being completely efficient. I'm not the only one who feels this way either. When 2 Black released and new and old fans alike played the game, social media was pretty quickly flooded with one simple question: why aren't there more games like Ninja Gaiden, or other pure action games like Devil May Cry, also called character action games? And why has every developer or publisher instead decided to make or fund Souls-likes the last several years? It's a pretty valid question to ask, and even though I do love Souls-likes, I find myself asking it too. Action games like Ninja Gaiden, Devil May Cry, God Hand, etc. have been around for way longer, and we still do get some great games occasionally like Hi-Fi Rush, and there seems to be a bit of a movement of big action games coming from China as well as some promising indie games, so maybe we won't be having this whole conversation for much longer anyway. But as of right this very moment, there is a distinct lack of games trying to capitalize on the ideas presented from the pure action games back from the mid-2000s to mid-2010s. At one point around 2005 or so, they were pretty popular, because that's when Ninja Gaiden Black, Devil May Cry 3, and God of War all released in close proximity. But even after that, this particular type of action game was still confined to a few key studios who contributed the most to it, such as Capcom, Team Ninja, and especially Platinum Games. Even though most of these games were fairly successful and had very loyal fans who would play anything remotely similar, the genre never truly blew up and sparked a huge trend that a ton of other studios followed. But after From Software came along and released 4 successful games across 6 years with Demon's Souls, Dark Souls 2, and Bloodborne, suddenly everyone wanted a piece. In fact, some of the early imitators even started development before Dark Souls 2 even came out. And now, in 2025, Souls-like is its own subgenre, and it's already pretty stuffed. What's disappointing though is that, in spite of how many Souls-likes there are now, very few of them actually reach the level of quality put out by From Software. So many developers in the last 10 years tried or are trying to make their own Souls-likes, yet hardly any are even as good as Demon's Souls, the first real Souls game. If anything, that should be a sign to try something else, so why not a pure action game without all those RPG elements to worry about? It's not like pure action hasn't been done at various levels of budget, from indies to AAA, so what's the holdup? Well, the answer for why there isn't more is pretty straightforward and obvious. Good and deep action gameplay is really hard to make and get right. For example, let's do a quick, basic mechanical comparison between the two subgenres. There's a ton of weapons in Elden Ring, sure, but how many different types of physical attacks are there really? A one-handed and two-handed light attack, which can go up to a 2 or 3 hit string, a one-handed and two-handed heavy attack, which may also go up to a 2 or 3 hit string, a jumping attack, a rolling attack, a sprinting attack, a riposte, a backstab, and maybe a dual-wielding attack of some sort that's shared between multiple weapon types. That's pretty much it. In terms of functionality, you can make a fully fledged weapon moveset with this checklist. Someone at FromSoft could maybe knock this out in a few days, perhaps even just one, because these are all the moves you're given for any single weapon, and there's no real way to do a true, uninterruptible combo between them. You can't seamlessly transition from one into the other, such as doing a rolling attack and then canceling into a heavy. That's not a natural combo. An enemy can dodge or block between each hit. The game is pretty strict with how attacks work. Outside of natural strings, they're all isolated from each other and have very clear startup, active, and recovery frames, with no canceling into one another. That's a mechanical hurdle these games typically just avoid. You can do block canceling and weird stuff like crouch canceling, but that tech is best used for PvP. There's no real need to whip that stuff out in single player. Conversely, how many attacks are in a game like Devil May Cry, and how many combos are there per weapon? And I'm talking about every unique sequence. That's a list that could take hours to make, and many moves have a very specific gameplay purpose too, whether it's to interrupt enemy attacks, stun them, parry them, launch them into the air, or for extending combos, keeping yourself in the air, or repositioning, creating or closing space. Many moves have a very specific purpose on top of dealing damage that need to consistently function. Not only is it a huge mechanical task, it's a huge animation one too, because attack animations with Rebellion are not going to look the same as animations with Cerberus, or in Ninja Gaiden's case, attacks with the Dragon Sword are not going to look the same as attacks with the Tonfa. There's a lot of animation reuse across weapons in Elden Ring and the Souls games as a whole, because there's distinct weapon classes, and the main differences between all weapons in one class is mostly their statistics, not moveset, though moveset can be important depending on what you're looking for. Souls games are not pure action. Every weapon isn't supposed to have their own bespoke animations and functions. That's not the kind of variety these games go for. Instead, they aim for build variety and enemy variety, so the player can come up with different strategies to the same problem, whether it's bashing the enemy in the head with the biggest stick they can find, exploiting elemental weaknesses from a distance, or just getting naked and rolling. There's a reason why challenge runs are a big thing. These games are very conducive to them, because it's about what you put on your character and not about the crazy shit you can make them do with a high amount of actions per minute. That's what the pure action games are about, and that's why they're harder to design. They need way more fine-tuning to get right, or you'll end up with Devil May Cry 2 instead of 3, and no developer wants that. Any studio that doesn't have either the passion or the prior experience making this type of game is typically unwilling to try, because it's a big task, especially for a genre that's still pretty niche. And I know that's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because if more devs took the chance to make pure action games, then the genre might be more popular. But, as of right now, pure action games aren't exactly setting sales records. Even Devil May Cry 5, the biggest out of all of them, just barely hit the 10 million sales mark after being out for 6 years. Elden Ring hit that number in just 2 or 3 weeks. Some people want to be pretty dramatic and pretend there's some secret, shadowy game developer cabal that's out to make action games homogenous in some grand, sinister scheme, but it's not like that. The boring, straightforward reason is that it's really fucking hard to make good, pure action games, and Souls-likes are just on fire right now. But again, China and the indie scene are both trying to pick up the action game slack, so maybe this conversation will be very different in 2 or 3 years. And speaking of homogeneity, there's one specific game mechanic that's become somewhat controversial among a particular group of action game players recently: parrying. Basically, every action game that's come out in the last several years has parrying in some form or another, and some of them even make the move the centerpiece of the combat loop. As a result, there's an increasing concern that parrying is making action games very formulaic and in some cases too forgiving. At first, I thought this complaint was kind of ridiculous, but after thinking back on all the action games I've played in the last several years, there is some validity to this concern. However, I still believe it's partially poisoned by excessive panic in some respects. So, why has parrying become so common? Again, there's no industry-wide conspiracy. The real reasons are pretty straightforward. The first and most obvious one, parrying is cool. Parrying in an action game looks cool and makes you feel cool, and that's a primary concern for many people who play these types of games. They want to look and feel like badasses. If any game genre would be correct to prioritize the rule of cool, it's pure action games like these, and parrying is probably the easiest way to get that done. After that would be the second most common mechanic of perfect dodges, as seen in Bayonetta and Final Fantasy XVI. Both mechanics have resemblances, specifically being timing-based, which seems to be the crux of many people's issue with them. Both parrying and perfect dodges are very powerful equalizers that allow you to totally bypass combat interactions after some practice. But the enemy throwing out an attack for you to parry or dodge usually is meant to be the interaction. This is a topic that might warrant its own video, but one thing I've learned from watching or reading developers discussing the base concepts and design goals of their game is that there's things they don't want to challenge the player on because it would detract from what they do want to challenge the player on. And if they want to challenge the player's ability to perform timing-based maneuvers, then that's their prerogative. Furthermore, if you get good enough at almost any game, you can completely skip interactions anyway. This isn't a phenomenon limited to pure action games. Even turn-based RPGs let you take advantage of weaknesses and status effects to potentially nuke bosses so fast you don't even see half of their attacks, even if it's your first time playing. In some cases, there's options to one-shot bosses, such as Final Fantasy letting you kill zombie enemies instantly by throwing a phoenix down or casting life on them. High or even just above average level play is not representative of everyone's experiences with a game, especially since most people don't even play a game for long enough to become particularly knowledgeable or good at it in the first place. Seriously, just look at the achievement or trophy stats for any given game and you'll figure that out very quickly. Another comment I don't agree with is combat based around strict timing windows being fake difficulty. Frankly, this one puzzles me, because an opinion I have always held and seen many others hold is that fair difficulty is when strict gameplay aspects like this allow you to adapt and slowly make the game easier with practice. And fake difficulty is when you're forced to take hits you have no idea are coming until it's too late, meaning the game completely ignores your skill level and takes agency away from you. Typically, people don't enjoy it when an action game removes control. It feels contradictory to the idea that it's skill-based, at least in part. I called parrying and perfect dodges equalizers a minute ago, and that's another reason why people like them. They're reliable ways to get past offense. And why shouldn't you be allowed to get past offense once you put the time into practicing doing so? I believe the very idea of a game starting off difficult but getting easier with practice is the essence of a well-made action game. This might sound too lenient, but if you take the time to perfect the timing and function of your defense, or offense, because in some games that is the best defense, then you should be allowed to waltz through the game untouched. Now don't misunderstand, I can appreciate wanting to be kept on your toes in different ways as a game goes on. I am not against that idea and enjoy games that do it too. But if a game clearly wants me to practice at a specific mechanic, then why should it regularly be putting me in situations where that practice doesn't matter? To many, that's just bad player feedback and reeks of inconsistency, which is arguably the biggest crime an action game can commit. It just doesn't feel good, and game feel is a very important aspect to action games, as nebulous as the concept might be sometimes. This also circles back around to being another part of looking and feeling cool. Being able to go back and clear out rooms of enemies and utterly crush bosses without getting so much as a scratch is a reward in itself. It feels cool as fuck. With all that said though, parrying can be implemented in good and bad ways. Good ways to implement parrying is to simply keep them as a high-risk, high-reward method of defense. Some people may resent Souls-like combat for being everywhere nowadays, but typically they do a decent job at keeping parries in that level of risk-reward balance, though admittedly the timing can be quite generous depending on the game. If you time a parry right, you can do a riposte for huge damage. If you time it wrong, you're gonna eat shit, and that's fine. It's tough enough that most people still prefer to just dodge. Another way of implementing parries in a good way is the Royal Guard method of Devil May Cry, where if you time a guard correctly, you can gain a big boost to your style meter and a boost to your Devil Trigger gauge. But if you mistime it, then you still block, but you spend Devil Trigger instead. This is less risky than just mistiming it and getting slammed, but it does make it clear that Royal Guard is something that requires practice. And if you don't and have a habit of hitting it early, you'll run out of DT, which will make blocking impossible until you have some back, and you can't activate Devil Trigger anymore, which is needed to regain health and survive difficult fights, etc. The consequences of fishing for that perfect block are more passive, but still big. At the end of the day though, you can still get through the game just fine without ever touching Royal Guard anyway, because the game has a ton of defensive options, such as having invincibility frames for every type of jump and dodge, which is a little fact that new players take a very long time to realize. Basically, the best ways to have a parry is to give them some sort of negative effect if you fail them, and ensure the player has other ways to reliably defend themselves if parries are too tough to pull off or don't cover every situation. Now, probably the biggest issue with parrying mechanics is that sometimes it's so strong that it becomes the only defensive maneuver people use. In the worst case, a game pretends it offers defensive options that are just as good, but parrying is the only thing that actually rewards you with big opportunities, so you feel obligated to parry anyway. So players are now ignoring other options entirely. Or, to reframe it slightly, it's also pretty annoying when a game tries to convince you that parrying is totally non-essential and can be ignored if you want, but if you don't do it, you can get two-shotted by trash mobs. This can be a problem that makes a game very repetitive, and it can be invasive in a game where people don't expect the mechanic to pop up. For example, I do love the combat of Like a Dragon Infinite Wealth. One thing it did though was bring back the perfect block mechanic from the previous game that lets you shave off damage from an enemy attack with the press of a button right before it connects, even though it's a turn-based game. It can be helpful for tougher fights, and maybe even necessary for the most brutal ones, but thankfully, the game does not expect you to perform it 100% of the time. Enemy damage is not balanced around the assumption that you'll master perfect blocking immediately after starting the game. If it was, it would be insufferable. If a game has multiple enemy types that are vulnerable to different forms of counters, but parrying remains the absolute strongest option against all of them, then it feels mandatory. It can dilute every encounter into the same few steps every single time, but it still depends on the game. People who hate the prevalence of parrying might point the finger at Sekiro for making things worse, because its entire combat experience centers around deflecting and the posture gauge. But Sekiro's combat is also loved for that exact reason. Because parrying is the weight-bearing mechanic for all combat, it offers a high level of consistency. If you can nail this one mechanic down, then you can finish the whole game. Of course, it's not the only thing you'll be doing. You will still dodge, use prosthetics, and Makiri counters, but if you can deflect, then you can do those things too. What some people might bemoan as homogeneity in some games is simply considered reliability to others. Now, you could make the argument that maybe you should be punished a little bit more for missing a deflection in Sekiro, but that's a bit of a slippery slope, because deflecting is such a core element of the game that making it more punishing might be like adding more punishment to aiming down sights in a military shooter. It's something you're expected to do in basically every fight, so it would be giving mixed messages if you're kicked in the balls for doing it. Again, those contradictory signals don't feel very good. A balance is definitely required. To summarize everything, I know the heavy presence of Souls-likes is sometimes annoying, especially when there's other types of action games that suffer from a lack of new releases. Seeing a promising action game only to find out it's another Souls-like might be frustrating, but pure action games are just really difficult to get right. I absolutely do wish we got more Ninja Gaiden and Devil May Cry clones, yes, but if you're going to make games like those, you need serious dedication and, ideally, previous experience too. There's some interesting upcoming games from Chinese and indie developers, which is great, and I'm keeping my eye on them, but even then, it's no guarantee they'll all be home runs. Souls-likes are plentiful because they're just simpler at a mechanical level. They're popular because they rest in a Goldilocks zone of high challenge, high gratification, high variety, and low complexity. It's not a surprise that any studio would want to make one. And in regard to parrying, yes, there's some poor implementation of the mechanic, but it's popular for a reason too. Players feel cool for performing them, and they add a protective layer of consistency so that anyone playing the game knows they have a strong defensive option to use when they need to. Though it usually requires some practice, and it should, because a defensive mechanic so strong shouldn't be so brainless. Parrying can make a game boring if it ends up being the only worthwhile defensive maneuver in the game, but some people enjoy that reliability too. That one mechanic that anchors the entire experience, keeps it focused, and is always useful. It just comes down to implementation and what other mechanics are surrounding it. Not every game mechanic trend is some grand conspiracy to create homogeneity. Sometimes these trends persist because they sit in that small but important spot where both developers and players enjoy that thing, because it's easy to implement for the former and satisfying to use for the latter. Yeah, it can get tiring if you lose interest, or if you never cared for it at all, but that's just the nature of every trend. Back in 2005, Resident Evil 4 and God of War came out only 2 months apart from each other, and that was apparently enough to make everyone have to deal with 10 years of QTEs in action games. Sometimes they were implemented thoughtfully, and sometimes they were intrusive and annoying and used as an obvious and poor attempt to mask a lack of real depth. This shit just happens. Before I close the video, please consider checking out my merch store. As of right now, I have 2 shirt designs, a sliced skull and a tribute to Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy series. I also have a beanie with my logo embroidered on it, great for the cold weather. Both shirt designs are available in lightweight fabric and heavyweight cotton. I've already received samples of everything for quality checking, and I can confirm they look great in person. If you're interested, visit mildconviction.com or check the store tab of my YouTube channel page. This concludes my thoughts on Souls-likes taking over the action genre and the Parry Problem. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.